8:59 a.m., August 17th, 1943. Over New Guinea, 10,000 feet above a green hell of jungle and kunai grass. Lieutenant Robert Hayes is about 3 seconds from dying. His P-38 Lightning is nose up in a climbing left turn that he never should have started. The world outside the canopy is an insane carousel of blue sky, white cloud, and the silver wings of Mitsubishi Zeros cutting in tighter with every heartbeat. Doctrine says you don't do this. Doctrine says you don't turn with a zero. Doctrine says you dive away, you use speed, you boom and zoom. Doctrine is about to get him killed. On his right side, a pale green A6M arcs up inside his turn, the red meatball on its wing growing bigger, its pilot rolling effortlessly to match every hesitation in Hayes's climb. The Zero's nose is already sliding ahead of him, curving for the lead. Hayes can almost see the Japanese pilot's eyes behind the glass. He hauls the P-38's control wheel to the right, trying to snap roll out of the turn into a desperate reversal, the way he's tried 5 times before. On every other mission, this is where the lightning betrayed him, where he'd feel the mush, that sickening moment when he moved the stick and nothing much happened, the ailerons lagging a half-second behind his hands, the big twin-engine fighter wallowing just enough for the Zero to cut the corner and rake him with 20 mm. But today, something's different. The stick bites. There's no slop, no dead zone. The instant he shoves the wheel, the P-38 answers. The left wing drops harder than he expects, the aircraft knifing over onto its back and slicing under the Zero's nose, instead of lumbering into its guns. For one surreal moment, Hayes watches tracer fire streak through the empty air where he would have been, then his own sights swing across the Zero's belly at point-blank range. He squeezes the trigger. 4 50 cal Brownings and a Tooth. Cannon chew the enemy fighter from wing root to cockpit. The Zero rolls over trailing flame and smoke, corkscrewing down into the jungle canopy below. Hayes snaps back into level flight, heart in his throat, eyes already searching for the next threat. 10 miles away, back at Dobodura Airfield, Technical Sergeant James McKenna is standing on the PSP runway, fists clenched so tight his knuckles are white, waiting for specks to reappear on the horizon. 17 minutes ago, he watched Hayes's P-38 take off with what every officer on the field would have called a stupid, unauthorized modification. A 6-inch piece of scavenged piano wire bent into a Z-shape and clamped onto a control cable. If he was wrong, he's just sent a 23-year-old pilot to die. If he's right, the way every Lightning in New Guinea fights is about to change. We're going to rewind those 17 minutes, and the 8 months before them, to see how a line mechanic with greasy hands and a bad attitude beat both the Zero and the factory manual. Dobodura Airfield, New Guinea, was a strip of pierced steel planking carved out of swamp and jungle by men who were already too tired to care about comfort. For 8 months, that rust-brown ribbon of metal had been Technical Sergeant James McKenna's whole universe. He knew every bump in it from pushing bomb carts. He knew every shimmer of heat on it from watching pilots taxi out, some for the last time. McKenna was 27, same age as a lot of the lieutenants he served, but with a different kind of mileage. Before the war, he'd worked at a Lockheed service depot in Southern California. He'd cut his knuckles on Electra nacelles and P-38 prototypes, while company men in ties argued about performance curves. When the Army Air Forces grabbed him, they made him a crew chief on the very fighter he'd been helping debug in peacetime, the twin-engine, twin-boom P-38 Lightning. On paper, it was the perfect answer to Japanese air power. Fast, long-legged, deadly at altitude, twin engines that could drag you home on one prop if the other took a hit. Nose-mounted guns that hit like a sledgehammer instead of scattering bullets all over the sky. Against bombers and in high-speed intercepts, it was a monster. Down low, in the sweaty, cramped dogfights over New Guinea, it had a problem the manual didn't like to talk about. Japanese A6M Zeros were lighter, more agile, and frighteningly tight in the turn. In a flat, horizontal circle fight, they could come around in half the time a P-38 needed. That alone was bad enough. What made it lethal was something almost no pilot could quite name, and almost no officer wanted to admit: lag. The Lightning's aileron control cables ran a long, tortuous path, out from the cockpit, through the wing roots, back into each boom, over pulleys at the tail, then forward again to the control surfaces. Factory tolerances allowed a little slack in that system. At the bench in Burbank it was a shrug, 3/8 of an inch of play at full stick deflection. Within spec, nothing to worry about. In a real turning fight, at 220 knots, 100 feet off the deck with a Zero clawing for your tail, that 3/8 of an inch turned into a perceptible delay. You hauled on the wheel. The cable straightened, the pulleys loaded. Then, a fraction of a second later, the ailerons finally bit. By then, the nimble little Mitsubishi had already cut a slice inside your intended arc. On July 9th, McKenna watched Lieutenant David Chen, 3 weeks in theater from Sacramento, always talking about going home to open a garage, launch with a grin, and never come back. Pilots who made it out of fights they shouldn't have survived described the same thing over and over in debriefs. I tried to roll out. The Zero beat me to it. My hands moved, but the airplane felt like it thought about it first. Every time McKenna tensioned a cable and saw that tiny bit of slack, his stomach turned. He brought it up quietly to the squadron engineering officer. "The aileron cables are in spec, Sergeant," the man said, tapping the open maintenance manual. "Lockheed says this is acceptable. You want to change it? Write a letter to California." "Sir, by the time California writes back, we'll be out of pilots," McKenna answered. The captain closed the book. "This isn't a depot," he said. "You're not authorized to modify flight control systems. You maintain to manual. That's it." The next week, 2 more P-38s didn't come home. Officially, the paperwork said pilot error. Men weren't following doctrine. They were trying to turn with zeros instead of zooming away. Unofficially, McKenna stood on the edge of the strip at sunset and watched an empty sky where 3 lightnings should have been, and decided the problem wasn't just tactics. It was steel, cable, slow, and no one above him was going to fix it in time. The idea came from a scrap heap. There's a kind of man whose brain never stops seeing ways to make machines behave. McKenna was one of those. He couldn't sit on an ammo crate without wondering if it would make a better jack stand. He couldn't look at a bent panel without mentally turning it into a bracket. 2 months before Hayes's mission, a P-38 had bellied in hard at Dobodura. The pilot walked away. The airframe did not. For weeks, its broken carcass had been cannibalized for parts. One afternoon, McKenna stood by what was left of the wing root, thinking about cable slack, when he noticed a coil of piano wire hanging from a peg. The wire had been part of a damaged trim tab assembly, stiff, springy, with a memory for straightness. He picked up a length of it, rolled it between thumb and forefinger, and felt the way it wanted to snap back when bent. Tension. The aileron cable didn't need heavier pulleys or new routing. It needed something to take up the slack, something that would quietly preload the line, so that when a pilot moved the stick, the first millimeter of input wasn't wasted, straightening a lazy loop of steel. He cut a 6-inch piece of wire, bent it into a crude Z, hook at one end, hook at the other, offset in the middle like a stretched spring. On a dead airframe in the shade of a palm, he clipped one end of the Z to the aileron cable, the other to a structural lug, and watched it pull the line taut. 3/8 of an inch of sag vanished. He plucked the cable like a guitar string. It hummed sharper. He stared at it, heart thudding, imagining the look on the engineering officer's face. Regulations were clear. The Army Air Force's maintenance manual had entire sections in bold. No field modifications to primary flight control systems without manufacturer approval. Lockheed was 7,000 miles away. Pilots were dying here. McKenna turned the Z-spring over in his hand and thought of David Chen. Of the way Chen had leaned on a crate, talking about cars they'd fix up after the war. Of the empty bunk still sitting with his name over it. He didn't go to the engineering officer. He didn't fill out a form. He walked down the line to P-38 tail number that belonged to Lieutenant Robert Hayes. Hayes wasn't a star. 6 missions, no kills, competent, not gifted, the kind of quiet, steady kid McKenna liked. He waited until Hayes was in the briefing shack, listening to a harried captain talk about patrol altitudes and probable intercept points. Then he slid under the left wing, opened an access panel near the boom, and exposed the run of aileron cable. With practiced fingers, he clipped the Z-shaped wire between the cable and an anchor point, bending it just enough to add what his feel and experience told him was about 0.4 of a pound of additional tension. The sag disappeared. No obvious hardware had been altered. In the shadowed interior of a P-38, it looked like any other bit of rigging. The whole job took 8 minutes. When the inspection crew came by that morning, their checklists were focused on oil levels, turbocharger controls, hydraulic fluid, ammo belts. No one plucked the aileron cables. McKenna closed the panel, wiped sweat and grease from his hands, and watched as Hayes walked out onto the line carrying his parachute and oxygen mask. "Bird ready, Sarge?" Hayes asked casually, sliding into his climb into the cockpit. "Best one I've got," McKenna said. It was the truth, just not the whole truth. As the P-38's twin Allisons coughed to life and the props blurred into gray discs, McKenna stepped back and shaded his eyes. He watched the Lightning taxi out, turn into the wind, and start its takeoff roll. From the perimeter, the twin-boom fighter looked no different from any other. Only McKenna and a 6-inch pie of stupid wire knew otherwise. The mission was simple on paper. A morning patrol up the coast. Intercept any Japanese reconnaissance. Screen bombers inbound for a strike deeper into New Guinea. The part the paper didn't show was the note from intelligence. 18 Zeros operating out of a forward strip up the chain, aggressive, well-led, eager to tangle with Lightnings. By the time Hayes reached altitude, his flight of 4 P-38s had already been painted by Japanese eyes. At 7:59 a.m., twin contrails carved across a pale blue sky. At 8:03, dark specks appeared ahead, Zeros climbing to meet them, sunlight glinting on rounded wingtips. Lightning led. "This is 2. Tally 18 bandits, 11 o'clock high," came a voice over the radio. "Copy. Stay fast. No turning with those bastards," the flight leader replied. Doctrine, drilled into him on every briefing. They dove in from above, as trained, trying to convert altitude into speed and surprise. For the first few seconds, it worked. Hayes picked a trailing Zero, walked his gun sight across its path, and squeezed. Tracer arced out, stitched wing and cockpit. The Japanese fighter staggered and fell, trailing smoke. His first kill. Somewhere under the adrenaline, that registered. Then the engagement degenerated into the swirling chaos no doctrine can fully tame. The Japanese leader rolled his formation into climbing spirals, drawing the P-38s upward, inviting them to bleed energy in pursuit. One American overshot, tried to tighten his spiral, found his big twin-engine ship sluggish in the roll, and in the time it took his ailerons to catch, a Zero slid inside his turn and blew a wing off. "Three's hit! Three's hit!" crackled over the radio. Flame, a spinning streak, no parachute. Hayes felt his mouth go dry. He remembered every lecture. Don't turn with them. Don't. Use your speed. Extend out. Climb back in. But speed was theoretical in this down on TS. He-deck blender. Altitude margins had evaporated. He was already close enough to see individual panel lines on the nearest Zero. That's when his instincts and his training collided. A pair of Zeros snapped onto his tail in a classic scissors, one high, one low, trading position with each turn, edging closer. Every time he tried to roll out, the old familiar lag caught him, except it didn't. The first time he yanked hard left, the Lightning responded so sharply it almost surprised him, wing carving into the turn with none of the soft delay he'd come to expect. He thought it was adrenaline. The second time, as a Zero tried to climb past his nose, he hauled the wheel right and felt the aircraft snap into a bank so crisp it shoved him sideways in the seat. For a split second, Confusion punched through his fear. What the hell did McKenna do to my bird? He didn't have time to wonder. He saw the high Zero commit to a lead turn, trying to predict where the ponderous P-38 would be in 2 seconds. Hayes decided to be somewhere else in 1. He rammed the stick forward and left, rolling out a plane and diving under the Zero in a move that had gotten him killed in training flights, where the delay between input and response had always left him hanging just a moment too long. This time, the lightning knifed through the air, the ailerons biting hard as soon as he moved the wheel. The Zero's gun spat harmlessly into the space he'd just vacated. As the Mitsubishi sailed wide, slightly out of position, Hayes yanked back into a climbing right turn, using both engines and his newfound responsiveness to pivot the heavy fighter onto the Japanese Pilot 6. For the first time in his short combat career, he felt like he was ahead of a Zero in a turn, not behind it. His gun sight glass filled with the rounded fuselage and red Hinomaru. He didn't think. He just squeezed. The Zero came apart. For the next 12 minutes, Hayes flew on the edge of blacking out, diving, climbing, rolling, turning just enough and just sharply enough to deny the Zeros the easy step inside and rake him routine they'd used on so many Lightning pilots before him. He didn't suddenly have a Spitfire. The P-38 still could. You wouldn't match a Zero in a sustained flat circle. But he could start his moves sooner. He could reverse harder. He could turn defensive maneuvers that had once been desperate prayers into calculated escapes. When the fuel and ammo counters finally forced his flight leader to call disengagement, 3 P-38s turned for home. 1 was missing. But Hayes was still alive, and he had 2 smoking kills confirmed by the others. For a pilot who'd gone up with 0 on his tally, that was more than survival. It was proof. Something had changed in the way his airplane answered his hands. When Hayes taxied back onto the steel planking at Dobodura, his legs wouldn't stop shaking. It wasn't fear anymore. It was aftershock. His crew swarmed the Lightning, doing what they always did after a hot mission, checking for holes, smelling for fuel leaks, feeling for heat where heat shouldn't be. McKenna's eyes went straight to the pilot's face. He saw the look there before Hayes even unclipped his harness. Not just the wide eyes of a man who's seen tracers reach for him, something else, disbelief tinged with exhilaration. "How'd she do?" McKenna asked, more casually than he felt. Hayes dropped to the tarmac, helmet hanging from one hand, then grabbed the crew chief by the shoulder and pulled him close. "What did you do to my airplane?" he demanded in a low voice. McKenna's heart lurched. "What do you mean, Lieutenant?" He played dumb, glancing around at nearby ground crew. "She moved," Hayes said, searching for words. Like she knew what I wanted before I finished asking. No lag. I rolled under a Zero that should have cut me in half. Twice." He shook his head, almost laughing, the kind of wild chuckle men get when they realize they're not dead. "You touch my controls?" McKenna exhaled slowly. "Just took up some slack," he admitted quietly. "Cable was talking back to me every time I checked it. Spec says it's fine. My gut said it isn't." Hayes stared at him. "That stupid wire thing you were grousing about last month?" he asked. "Something like that," McKenna said. Before the conversation could go any further, the squadron intelligence officer walked up with a clipboard. "Nice work out there, Lieutenant," he said briskly. 2 confirmed, maybe 3. Debrief in 10. And whatever you did," he flicked a glance at the nose art, "do it again tomorrow." Word got to the engineering officer before the day was out. He called McKenna into his tent, maintenance manual open. On the table like a holy book. "I hear you've been making unauthorized adjustments to primary control systems," he said, voice dangerously mild. McKenna considered lying. Then he thought of Hayes's face, of Chen's empty bunk, of the hole in the sky where 3 used to be. "I added a tension spring to 1 aileron cable," he said, "from scrap. Took up 3/8 of an inch of slack. That's it." "That's it?" the officer snapped. "Sergeant, that's the difference between a certified airworthiness condition and an untested science project. You know damn well we don't have authority to—" "Sir," McKenna cut in, surprising himself, We don't have the luxury of waiting for California to catch up. They're not the ones dodging cannon shells while their control cables stretch. For a moment, the tent was very quiet. Outside, an engine coughed as someone ground-started a generator. "You'll remove it," the officer said at last. "Immediately." "With respect, sir," McKenna said. "You'll have to tell Lieutenant Hayes that yourself. After what he did out there, I'm not touching that cable unless he orders me to." It wasn't a threat. It was just the truth. The officer's jaw worked. "Bring him," he said finally. "We'll settle this the right way." That afternoon, in front of a tired CO and a stack of maintenance reports, a mechanic and a pilot, two men usually at the bottom of the decision ladder, explained in plain language how a 6-inch wire had helped a P-38 do something its designers 5,000 miles away had said it wasn't supposed to do. The colonel listened. He looked at the loss statistics for the last 6 weeks. He looked at Hayes's debrief sheet. Then he closed the manual. "For now," he said quietly, "that wire stays. On Hayes's bird only. And if he doesn't come back tomorrow, Sergeant, you and I will have a different kind of talk." McKenna nodded. It wasn't approval, but it was a crack in the wall. The next mission didn't end in a tribunal. It ended in more Zeros burning. Hayes went up again the following morning, this time leading a pair. The enemy tried the same baiting tactics, climb, spiral, drag the P-38s into a turnfight, and found again that one Lightning in particular seemed unnervingly willing to accept those terms. He should have died. Twice. Twice he used that crisp, immediate roll response to twist out of trap angles. Twice he came back with kill markings to paint under the cockpit. By the end of the week, pilots in the squadron were sidling up to their crew chiefs with the same question. "Can you make mine feel like Hayes's?" Ground crew talk travels even faster than pilot gossip. McKenna found himself in a quiet corner of the maintenance area one night with 3 other sergeants, a pile of piano wire, and a shared understanding they probably shouldn't put any of this on paper. They experimented carefully. Same Z-spring on the right aileron cable, matched tension, so there was no asymmetry. Check free and full travel of controls with a pilot in the seat. Watch for any sign of binding or over-center. They picked only the steadiest, most experienced pilots to try the modification first. Within a week, there were 4 P-38s in the squadron whose pilots described the same transformation Hayes had. No more mush at the onset of roll. No more sensation of asking politely before the airplane responded. Their kill-to-loss ratio ticked upward. It wasn't a miracle cure. Men still died. The Zero was still a vicious opponent in the right hands. But fewer Lightnings failed to come home from dogfights they should have survived. At some point, the numbers got too obvious to ignore. The 5th Air Force sent a technical team down from headquarters to investigate why one squadron's combat reports were suddenly showing better performance than sister units flying the same missions from neighboring strips. An older major with engineering insignia showed up on the line, clipboard in hand, crawling under Hayes's aircraft with a flashlight. When he found the Z-spring on the cable, he called McKenna over. "Whose idea was this?" he asked, holding the little piece of wire up between thumb and forefinger. McKenna swallowed. "Mine, sir." The major looked at him over the rims of his glasses. "You know you violated about 3 different orders doing this, Sergeant?" "Yes, sir." "You also know your squadron's aileron-related complaints have dropped to nearly 0 since this appeared?" The major added dryly. "Yes, sir." The engineer squinted at the spring again, then at the cable. "We saw this on the test stands," he admitted, surprising McKenna. "Knew there was a lag at certain tensions. Factory decided it was acceptable. Cheaper to live with it than re-rig the whole production line. Different calculus in Burbank than out here under fire." He handed the wire back. "Officially, I have to write this up as an unauthorized modification," he said. "Unofficially, I'm going to recommend a standardized field tensioner kit with better metallurgy than piano wire." Within a month, mimeographed sheets labeled Field Modification P-38 Cable Tension, Pacific, were circulating through 5th Air Force maintenance shops, complete with diagrams that looked suspiciously like McKenna's original Z-shape, now cleaned up and sanctioned. Other squadrons began reporting similar improvements. In later P-38 variants, Lockheed would incorporate hydraulic boost and other changes to improve roll at high speeds. Historians would trace that evolution back to wind tunnel data and design meetings. The men who were there knew it also traced back to a sweaty afternoon under a lightning wing and a sergeant who was tired of watching pilots die on schedule. Wars move on. By 1944, the air war in the Pacific was shifting to new islands, new ranges, new aircraft. P-47s and P-51s would share the skies with P-38s. Zeros would be met by Hellcats and Corsairs from carriers. The Lightning, once the cutting edge, became one of many tools. McKenna stayed with her as long as he could. He rode out the New Guinea campaign, nursed tired Allisons through tropical heat, swapped out cracked props in monsoon rain, installed a dozen more official tensioners that looked a lot like the stupid wire trick that had started them all. When the war finally ended, he went back to California. The Lockheed plant he'd once walked through as a civilian mechanic now had banners about victory hanging from its rafters. They'd built thousands of P-38s by then, many with improvements in their veins that had come from frontline reports, not just drafting tables. He got a job in a smaller garage instead. Fixed cars, tuned engines. Occasionally, when a customer complained that their steering felt sloppy, he would smile faintly and think about cable slack and the sensation of a control finally answering the instant you asked. Hayes survived the war too. He never became an ace. He never had his face plastered on recruiting posters. He did his missions, scored his kills, and came home with the quiet satisfaction of a man who knew he'd beaten the odds more than once for reasons he only partly understood. They never pinned a medal on McKenna for bending that piece of wire. There was no distinguished tensioner device ribbon. What he got instead, years later, was a letter from a pilot he barely remembered, forwarded through old unit contacts. The man wrote about how, on a certain August morning over New Guinea, his Lightning had suddenly felt like an extension of his body instead of a stubborn, heavy tool, that for the first time he'd moved, and it had moved. With him, not after him. He closed with a simple line, "Whoever figured that out, I owe you my life." In a small museum today, not one of the big national shrines, just a regional air museum tucked beside a secondary runway, you can sometimes find a P-38 on display. If you're lucky, and the curators are the kind who care, there might be a small placard under a cutaway of its control run. Field modifications in the Southwest Pacific included locally improvised tensioners on aileron cables to improve roll response in combat. These changes, initiated by line mechanics, contributed to later factory design updates. No names, no ranks, just a quiet acknowledgement that the war was not won only by colonels and engineers, but also by men with grease under their fingernails who were willing to break a rule when the rule was killing people. The story of how one mechanic's stupid wire trick made P-38s outmaneuver Zeros isn't really about magic hardware. It's about the gap between what a design can be on paper and what it must be in the field. About how doctrine that says never turn with them is a poor substitute for an airplane that actually listens to its pilot. About how someone, somewhere, has to look at a tiny, acceptable flaw and say, not for the men I'm sending up in this. If you've got someone like that in your family history, a mechanic, a rigger, an armorer who did something small that turned out to be huge, drop their story in the comments. Because in the end, wars are won less by the tools stamped out in factories than by the people who aren't afraid to make those tools better.